Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
We are diving into, well, extremely contentious material today. We're focusing on two main things.
Right.
First, the crucial historical context of Gaza, really getting into that.
Mm.
And second, these powerful alleged forces trying to suppress and control the narrative around Israel-Palestine, especially after October 7th.
Yeah, and our sources here are really centered around the, meticulous research, but also the very controversial personal accounts of a major academic figure, someone who spent decades on this.
Decades studying the conflict and, importantly, the methods used to silence dissent.
Exactly.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're not here to pick sides or endorse any viewpoint.
No, absolutely not.
We're acting as guides, clear-eyed guides, trying to give you that vital historical context and also expose the reported mechanics of how this narrative control works, especially in Western institutions.
The goal is really for you, the listener, to walk away feeling well-informed. Having absorbed some complex stuff quickly, but without feeling totally buried by it.
Right. So let's start where the sources insist we have to start, 1948.
Yeah, 1948, the creation of the State of Israel. But it happened alongside the mass expulsion. The sources used the term expulsion of the indigenous Palestinian people.
An event known widely as the Nakba.
The Nakba. And we're talking about the forced removal of roughly 750,000 people from their homes.
Wow, 750,000. And out of that huge number, about 300,000 were pushed directly into Gaza, right? Into that tiny strip of land.
Directly into Gaza. And that single event just fundamentally shaped its character. Overnight, it became this massive, concentrated area for refugees.
And that demographic reality persists today, doesn't it?
Absolutely vital to understand this. Today, something like 80% of Gaza's population are refugees from 48 or their descendants.
And legally, they're still considered refugees.
Under international law, yes. Still counted as refugees. And add to that about half the population, 50% are children.
So not a typical place at all. Defined by displacement, generational trauma, and just overwhelmingly young.
Exactly. Generational displacement and youth.
Now, what really struck me in the source material, and it's deeply unsettling, is how consistent the language used by outside observers was to describe Gaza. Over decades, regardless of who is in charge.
Right.
The sources keep citing this one phrase, huge concentration camp. Why was that specific term used so consistently?
Well, I think it boils down to the sheer density, the geography, the conditions. Even back then, even under Egyptian administration after 48, it was just inescapable.
So who used it first?
Elm Burns, who was the main UN official there right at the beginning, he used that description. Then decades later, 1967, Senator Gore, Al Gore's father,
Right.
he visited and he described it to the U.S. Congress as, and I quote, a huge concentration camp on the sand.
And it wasn't just outsiders looking in, was it? The sources mention Israelis using this term, too.
That's a key point. In 2002, Baruch Kimberling, a leading Israeli sociologist, called it the biggest concentration camp ever.
Ever. Wow.
And then just 2 years after that, Gore Island, who was head of Israel's National Security Council at the time, a very top official, described it in the exact same way. Huge concentration camp. This language, this recurring description, it sets a horrifying baseline for the conditions before the blockade we're about to discuss.
Exactly. Because things got even worse, didn't they? With the blockade imposed in 2006.
Right. After Hamas won the election, Israel imposed this blockade, controlling air, sea, land, basically what went in, what went out, who could enter, who could leave. Total control.
And the sources mentioned something about a diet, a calculated minimum.
Yeah, this is quite something. They state that Israel literally put the entire population of Gaza on what they called a humanitarian minimum diet.
Wait, they calculated the calories needed? For the whole population?
It calculated calories. The sources suggest an immense bureaucratic effort focused purely on subsistence. Not just subsistence, but just enough to avoid mass starvation being visible.
And the intention behind this micromanagement, what did the sources say?
The intention, according to source material, was apparently explicit. Create conditions so intolerable, so miserable, that the population would be forced to rise up and overthrow the government they had just elected.
So it wasn't hidden. Just enough food to avoid scenes of starvation? That's stark.
Very stark. Calculating caloric needs for over 1 million people. And the control, it extended to things that seem almost absurd.
Like what?
Well, the sources list specific items banned from import. Things like baby chicks, chocolate, potato chips, and cinnamon.
Cinnamon? Seriously, they were policing spices.
Cinnamon. The administrative effort to police spice imports, it just highlights the totality of the control over every tiny aspect of daily life.
And the result of all this? The living conditions.
Utterly degraded. To the point where The Economist magazine, not exactly known for inflammatory language, called Gaza a human rubbish heap.
A rubbish heap.
And a UN official apparently called it a toxic dump. Plus, you have to factor in the consequences like a staggering 60% unemployment rate among young people.
60%.
Yeah. The source argues this chronic suffering, this despair, provides the essential context for everything that came later.
Right. That backdrop of suffering is crucial for understanding the second part of our deep dive today. The professional and personal costs paid by people who dared to critique the power structures involved here.
Okay.
Let's start with the academic whose work is central to our sources. What's his background?
Well, to understand the stakes for him personally, the source emphasizes he's the son of Nazi Holocaust survivors.
Both parents.
Both parents. Warsaw Ghetto, Maidanek concentration camp, Avets death march. Every other member of his family was killed.
That kind of family history must inevitably shape one's perspective on mass suffering, on oppression, on resistance.
Absolutely. The source suggests it deeply informs his perspective. His political activity started around 1982.
And despite getting his PhD, his academic career faced significant obstacles.
Immense obstacles. It started really early. Back in 1984, he published work exposing a major bestseller, a book called From Time Immemorial, as what he termed a threadbare hoax.
And that had consequences.
Big consequences. According to him, he was effectively blacklisted after that. Couldn't get a stable university position, forced into adjunct roles.
Adjuncting. That's like the academic equivalent of being a substitute teacher, right? Low pay, no security.
Pretty much. Unstable, precarious work. And this whole situation, this marginalization, it culminated around 2007, 2008 with his denial of tenure at DePaul University.
Ah, the tenure denial. That was a big story, wasn't it?
It became a national story. The sources detail a very public, very intense pressure campaign against him. Figures like Alan Dershowitz were heavily involved in opposing his tenure.
And after that, after losing the tenure bid,
he recounts being, quote, completely unemployed and not just unable to find a paid position. He claims he was blacklisted so thoroughly he couldn't even volunteer to teach anywhere. Just a total professional shutout.
Okay, so he experiences this kind of career destruction firsthand. How does he then connect that personal experience to what he describes as a broader wave of censorship, especially the one we've seen ramp up since October 7th?
He sees a pattern, a mechanism being deployed now on a much larger scale.
And what is that mechanism, according to the source?
The claim is incredibly direct and very provocative. He alleges that a Jewish supremacist billionaire class is, quote, flagrantly using money as a blackmail weapon to silence criticism of an ongoing genocide.
That's an extraordinarily strong claim. Jewish supremacist billionaire class, blackmail weapon, ongoing genocide. Does the source provide concrete evidence that money, specifically, was the key factor in, say, removing those Ivy League presidents recently, and not just policy disagreements or internal politics?
The source focuses heavily on the timing and the nature of the pressure. It points to the fact that 3 Ivy League presidents were pushed out very quickly after October 7th.
You're right, that happened fast.
And the source argues this campaign kicked off with overt financial threats. People like Bill Ackman publicly threatening to pull huge donations.
I remember that.
And a petition from, I think it was 1,200 Jewish alumni at Harvard, explicitly threatening to cut contributions. The source also cites an anecdote. The deposed UPenn president allegedly told someone who offered sympathy, just 2 words, money talks, implying financial pressure was decisive.
So the argument is this wasn't just about specific statements or campus policies, but about raw financial power being used to enforce a line.
That's the core argument presented. And it extends beyond just removing presidents. The source claims these tactics influence who even gets appointed to high-level positions in the first place.
How so?
This is where the academic introduces a really controversial term, Jewish supremacist affirmative action, or JSA.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
As the source describes it, the idea is that demonstrating the correct political alignment, meaning hostility towards critics of Israel, becomes the main qualification for certain top jobs, overriding things like traditional professional background or, quote, competence.
So the claim is that people perceived as unqualified are getting top roles simply because they're seen as being in the club, politically speaking.
Precisely. The source uses the example of Barty Weiss becoming president of CBS News, arguing this illustrates the mechanism where perceived political loyalty trumps standard professional qualifications for certain roles.
And what about the tactics used against students, against younger activists? The source mentioned those too.
Well, absolutely. And they're described as particularly brutal, aimed at creating a deep, lasting chill.
Like what kind of tactics?
Things like blacklisting students from major law firms, cutting off future careers before they even start, and the really aggressive use of doxing trucks.
Those trucks driving around campuses with students' pictures?
Yes, displaying their pictures, names, calling them terrorists. But it gets worse. The source documents a case where these trucks were driven 500 miles away to the students' parents' homes.
Yeah, their parents' homes, 500 miles away.
Yeah. The message is clear. Dissent, and we can destroy your reputation, your future career, and even bring this fight right to your family's doorstep. It's calculated to instill maximum fear.
That's intense pressure. And alongside these direct threats, the source also talks about redefining what even counts as problematic speech on campus, right? Specifically around anti-Semitism.
Yes, a key part of controlling the narrative, according to the source, involves broadening the definition of anti-Semitism. They point to Harvard, where the definition was allegedly expanded to include any situation where Jewish students simply feel excluded.
Feel excluded.
Excluded in class, in extracurriculars, even just in social life. If they feel excluded, it can be framed as anti-Semitism.
And what's the alleged consequence of that broadened definition?
The source argues it creates a kind of forced command to, quote, normalize child killers, referring to Israeli soldiers on campus, and that if you fail to, quote, pal around with them, if you shun them socially, you risk being branded an anti-Semite.
So it becomes a tool to enforce social and political conformity on campus, basically silencing criticism by making association mandatory.
That's the mechanism described in the source material, a way to shut down any form of social or political distancing from pro-Israel viewpoints.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, the source uses a specific historical analogy from American history to try and help understand the moral complexities around October 7th. Can you walk us through the Nat Turner comparison?
Right, the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved man in the U.S. who led a revolt in 1831. During that revolt, his followers killed enslavers and their families, men, women, children, even babies. Horrific violence.
Okay.
The source's point is this. If you only focus on Turner's religious fanaticism, which was real, and the brutality of the violence, you completely miss the essential context.
Which was?
Which was that he was a slave, living under and reacting against a system of brutal, dehumanizing enslavement. You can't judge the act without the context of slavery.
So the analogy to October 7th is that focusing only on Hamas's actions, their ideology, their violence,
while completely ignoring the decades of history, the 1948 expulsion, the conditions in Gaza described consistently as a concentration camp, the blockade, the lack of hope that ignoring this context leads to a fundamentally flawed moral judgment. It's judging the revolt without acknowledging the slavery, so to speak.
It forces you to confront the context, not just the event itself.
Exactly. Context versus just the isolated act.
Now back to narrative control. The source material takes a very critical look at the claims of widespread sexual violence during the October 7th attacks. What does it say about the evidence?
It specifically references the UN report by Pramila Patten. That report did conclude there were reasonable grounds to believe conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, occurred in several locations.
Okay, reasonable grounds, but...
But the source highlights that the very same UN report explicitly stated there was no medical evidence of rape found, no forensic evidence of rape.
No medical or forensic evidence. What about visual evidence?
That's the other key point from the source's reading of the report. Among 5,000 photographs and 50 hours of digital footage reviewed by the UN team, they found no photographic or digital evidence of sexual violence.
So reasonable grounds, based on accounts, but no physical or visual corroboration presented in that report. Despite this, the narrative of mass sexual violence was pushed very hard, wasn't it?
Very hard. And the source claims the primary audience for this push wasn't actually Israelis who, the source argues, didn't need more incentive for outrage or action after the attacks.
So who was the intended audience according to this analysis?
The source argues it was aimed squarely at Americans, specifically designed to resonate with and unfortunately exploit deep-seated tropes in American history.
What so? Which tropes?
Specifically, the historical use of false or exaggerated claims of sexual violence, particularly rape claims against black men, which were used for centuries to justify horrific violence like lynchings, especially during and after slavery. The source suggests this narrative tapped into that historical resonance.
And they cite Sheryl Sandberg's documentary as an example of pushing this narrative.
Yes, the former Meta COO making the documentary screams before silence. The source points to this as promoting the narrative vigorously, despite the acknowledged lack, in the UN report at least, of concrete material evidence, like forensic or photographic proof.
The ultimate conclusion the source draws from this is pretty stark, isn't it? Calling people who promote these narratives
Propagandists for genocide. That's the term used. Especially, the source adds, when you consider polling data showing that a significant minority, around 40% of American Jews, according to the poll cited, believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza.
So it's positioning these narratives as actively enabling or justifying actions that a large segment of the population, even within the Jewish community, views as potentially genocidal.
That the argument laid out, a very serious charge.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what we've presented to you today, based on these sources, is this really stark duality.
Yeah, on one side you have this massive, undeniable humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, built on decades of history we've touched on.
And on the other side, you have what the source describes as this brazen, incredibly well-funded, systematic effort to control the public narrative about it, to suppress dissent, particularly in Western democracies.
Using tactics ranging from financial blackmail of institutions to direct intimidation and blacklisting of students and academics.
The price of resistance, as described, is clearly very high. Losing jobs, facing public campaigns, the doxing, it's severe.
Undeniably high. But the source material also seems to suggest that despite this pressure, the truth, or at least a different perspective, is getting through somehow. Public opinion is shifting.
Yeah, you see the pushback, the campus protests, the arguments becoming fiercer. The source suggests the very intensity and sometimes radical nature of the censorship attempts might actually be evidence that the established narrative is losing ground.
It's like the harder they push, the more questions people ask.
We also touched briefly on the source's critique of how identity, specifically referencing the Holocaust industry, is allegedly wielded, sometimes cynically, it's argued, to enforce political conformity, how historical victimhood can be instrumentalized.
Right. Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to mull over perhaps.
If, as the source contends, money and political power can be used so effectively to try and redefine historical narratives, to label critics, to silence dissent, even potentially redefining victims and villains, well, it raises a fundamental question.
What foundational truths about ourselves, about history, about justice are we actually willing to stand up and defend, even when it's difficult or costly?
That's definitely something to think about.